The sun hung mercilessly over the small western town of Dust Creek, painting the earth with a golden fire as the air filled with grit and sorrow. Along the dirt road, wagons creaked, horses pawed the ground, and townsfolk gathered with hushed whispers, their eyes fixed on a scene that would be carved into memory. In the middle of the street, a woman knelt in despair, her dress torn and dirt-stained, her wrists bound with rough rope. She was known to many as Mary Lou, widowed, just 2 years prior when her husband was killed in a cattle raid. Since then, she had fought tooth and nail to keep her small homestead alive, raising her little daughter Clara alone against the cruelty of drought, debt, and the merciless hands of men who preyed on the weak. Now she was at the mercy of such men, her child's tiny hand gripped by the rough fingers of a man who had no heart. Sheriff Callahan, a man who wore the badge not as a symbol of justice but as a tool of power, had declared that Mary Lou owed back taxes she could never hope to pay. As punishment, he had ordered Clara taken away, supposedly to be raised by a family who could provide. But everyone knew the truth. The child was being handed off like property, a pawn in the hands of men who controlled the land and the law alike. Mary Lou's scream tore through the air, raw and desperate. "Please, don't take my child away." Her knees dug into the dirt as her arms stretched out, trying to cling to the girl being ripped from her. Clara's tiny voice echoed her mother's cries, her face streaked with tears, her feet kicking up dust as she fought against the sheriff's grip. The crowd stood frozen, some turning away in shame, others shaking their heads in helplessness, for no one dared to stand against the sheriff's word. No one except the silent rancher. He stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and unyielding, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across his eyes. He was known simply as Elijah Kane, a man who had drifted into Dust Creek months ago with little more than his horse, his rifle, and a silence that spoke louder than most men's shouting. He worked his ranch land at the far edge of town, paid his dues, kept to himself, and rarely engaged in the quarrels of others. Yet there was something in the widow's cry, something in the sight of that child being torn from her mother's arms, that stirred a storm deep inside him. The sheriff's voice bellowed above the chaos, ordering his deputies to hold back the restless onlookers. "The law is the law," he declared, his smirk cutting through Mary Lou's pleas. But laws written by greed and enforced by cruelty had no meaning in the heart of a man like Elijah. His boots crunched against the dirt as he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, each stride drawing every pair of eyes toward him. The crowd parted slightly as whispers rippled through. "That's Kane, the rancher. He never gets involved." "What's he doing?" The widow's sobs choked into silence as she lifted her tear-stained face, her trembling lips parting as she locked eyes with him. For a heartbeat, hope flickered where despair had lived. The sheriff tightened his grip on the child, narrowing his eyes at the approaching figure. "Stay out of this, Kane," he warned, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. But Elijah Kane did not flinch, did not speak, and did not stop. The dust swirled around his boots. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment the entire town knew something was about to break, and nothing in Dust Creek would ever be the same again. The silence was heavy, charged like the moments before a thunderstorm, and every heartbeat in Dust Creek seemed to thump in unison as Elijah Kane closed the distance between himself and the sheriff. Mary Lou clutched at the dirt, her body trembling, her sobs caught between fear and the fragile spark of belief that anyone might save her child. Clara's cries grew weaker, the fight draining from her tiny frame, but her wide eyes never left the towering figure drawing closer, with the calmness of a man who had nothing to fear. Kane's shadow fell across the sheriff, and though he had not uttered a single word, his presence alone demanded an answer. Sheriff Callahan squared his shoulders, puffing his chest, desperate to assert his power. "This ain't your fight, Kane," he spat, though his voice betrayed the faintest edge of unease. The rancher's silence was his weapon, sharper than steel, heavier than a bullet. Kane's gaze shifted from the sheriff to the trembling girl in his grip, then down to the widow on her knees. Without warning, he extended a hand, palm steady, toward Clara. The sheriff laughed bitterly, gripping the girl tighter. "She's coming with me, and if you don't step back, rancher, you'll be 6 feet under before the sun sets." His deputies tensed, hands on their holsters, but none drew, for something in Kane's steady stance froze them in place. The rancher's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and finally, after what seemed like an eternity, his voice cut through the air, low, gravelly, and unshakable. "You'll have to kill me first." Gasps erupted from the crowd, a murmur of disbelief rippling through them like wildfire. No man had ever stood toe-to-toe with Callahan and lived to tell the tale. The sheriff sneered, his pride stung, his hand twitching toward his gun. But Kane was faster. With a sudden flash, his revolver was drawn, leveled and cocked, the barrel glinting under the harsh sun. The sheriff froze, his arrogance draining into fear. For in Kane's eyes there was no hesitation. No doubt only the promise of justice long overdue. "Let her go," Kane growled, each word carrying the weight of a hammer on an anvil. The sheriff's grip faltered, his bravado crumbling under the crushing silence that followed. Slowly, with shaking hands, he released Clara, who stumbled into her mother's arms, holding her as though she would never let go again. The crowd erupted in cheers, some shouting Kane's name, others crying in joy, for they had witnessed something they never thought possible: the breaking of tyranny by the hand of a silent rancher. Callahan, humiliated and beaten, backed away, muttering curses under his breath, but none dared to follow him. His reign of fear had ended in the dust of that very street. Kane holstered his weapon, his expression unchanged, his silence resuming like the calm after a storm. He turned his gaze toward Mary Lou, who whispered through her tears, "Thank you. You saved us." For the first time, his lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, and without a word he tipped his hat and walked away, disappearing into the horizon as if he were a phantom of justice, called forth only when needed. The town would never forget that day, and neither would Mary Lou or Clara, for the rancher who said little had spoken louder with his actions than any man of Dust Creek ever could. And to those watching this tale unfold right now, if you felt the power of this story, if your heart raced with the courage of Kane and the cry of the widow, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because more stories like this one await you. Tales of courage, hope, and the fight for justice in the untamed West. Stay with us, and let the stories ride on.